Amelia, you're no longer the most important person in this family. He and his kids are the real family now. Her cold words echoed in my mind, like a slap to my consciousness. My eyes widened in disbelief, but there was no shock in me. I had sensed that distance for a while, even though I always tried to hold onto my faith in my mother's love. But today, those words, as painful as they were, didn't make me break down. I simply stood still, unnervingly calm, as if I had known all along that this moment would come. My mother married a new man, and everything in our family gradually changed. The warm dinners we used to share became distant memories. My mother seemed to have forgotten about me, her only daughter. But it didn't break me. I had already grown accustomed to these changes. I just didn't expect the truth to be this cruel. Her words felt like a cold splash of water, but I didn't let emotions take control. They were just the final punctuation in a journey I had been preparing for a long time. I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't complain. She had chosen her path, and now all that was left for me was one goal: to uncover the truth and reclaim what was rightfully mine. It had been weeks since that fateful conversation with my mother, but the words she uttered still echoed in my mind, vibrating through every corner of my being. He and his kids are the real family now. Each time I replayed those words, a sharp pain cut through me, but more than that, a cold, calculating resolve settled in my chest. I had spent my life believing that I was loved unconditionally, that I was my mother's one true family. But the truth was now clear. I was an afterthought, and I was done pretending that it didn't matter. I had always seen the love between my mother and me as the strongest bond, something that could never be broken, not even by time. But when my mother married Gregory, things began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shift in her attention, a slight distance in her voice. I told myself it was just a phase, that we were going through an adjustment period. But when she gave him control over our family's finances and began transferring everything I had ever known as my inheritance to him and his children, the betrayal became undeniable. I spent countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle. I had been the apple of my mother's eye for so many years, her only child, the one she promised would inherit everything she built. But now it felt as though I was watching from the sidelines, a mere spectator to my own life, while Gregory and his children took center stage. One night, after a particularly awkward dinner where Gregory had smiled smugly across the table, his children laughing and chatting as though they belonged here, I had enough. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sense of determination washed over me. I was done feeling like an outsider in my own home. It was time to confront the situation head-on. I started with small things, quiet observations, collecting evidence of the decisions being made behind my back. The financial statements my mother used to go over with me were now secretive, buried under layers of bureaucracy. The once warm and inviting home had started to feel cold, a place where I was no longer welcome. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, as I sat alone in the study, that I discovered something I wasn't prepared for. Hidden beneath a stack of papers was a legal document, one that had been carefully folded to avoid notice. As I skimmed over it, my heart stopped. It was a will, a new one, that excluded me from any inheritance. My own mother, the woman who had promised me everything, had rewritten the future without me. The words blurred before my eyes as I tried to process what I was seeing. The document clearly stated that everything, from the family estate to the business I had grown up working in, would be passed to Gregory's children. The truth was as stark as it was painful. I wasn't just left out, I was erased. I didn't let myself react, at least not immediately. Instead, I took a deep breath, folded the paper back neatly, and tucked it into my bag. I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. I couldn't. As I walked out of the study, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about the broken trust, the shattered promises, and the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, the person who had become a stranger. The calmness I had been holding onto, the icy resolve that had taken over, was no longer a facade. I wasn't angry, not yet anyway, but I was done with the helplessness. I was done being the daughter who was pushed aside for the sake of a man and his children. And most importantly, I was done being quiet about it. The game had changed, and it was time for me to play. As I closed the door to the study, I already knew what had to be done. I was going to take back what was mine, no matter what it took. And this time, I wasn't going to do it quietly. The day after I found the will, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the edge of a cold coffee cup. The house was unusually silent. Gregory was away on a business trip, and his children were off with their mother, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around me. It was as though every corner of the house, every familiar space, was now tainted by the betrayal I had discovered. I didn't sleep much the night before, and even now, I could feel the exhaustion settling into my bones. But there was no time to rest. There was a plan to be made. I couldn't confront my mother yet. Not now. She was too unpredictable, too volatile. One wrong word and she would shut down, retreating behind her cold mask of indifference. No, I needed a strategy, something that would make her understand that I wasn't going to be erased from her life so easily. I spent the next few days carefully gathering information. The first step was understanding how deep Gregory's influence really ran. He had woven himself into every aspect of our family's affairs: business dealings, the financial trust, the charity work that my mother had been so passionate about. Everything was interconnected, and every thread led back to him. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how carefully he had orchestrated his takeover of everything that had once been mine. But I wasn't just fighting Gregory. I was fighting my mother too. I couldn't believe how easily she had let this happen. The woman who had once been a fierce protector of me, who had sworn that she would always be there for me, had silently allowed another man to take control. I had seen the subtle changes in her behavior, her softer tone when speaking to him, the way she looked at him with admiration and affection, as though he were her true family. It wasn't just the business or the inheritance that had been taken from me, it was her love, her loyalty. I had been replaced. I had to face the truth. My mother had chosen him, and she had made her decision long before I had even begun to realize the gravity of what was happening. The next step in my plan was to gain leverage. I needed to understand how far Gregory was willing to go to keep his hold on the family fortune. I began to visit the family business more often, watching the interactions between Gregory and the staff, the way he spoke with authority, with an air of entitlement. It was as if he had already claimed his place as the head of our family, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all me, take that away from him. I discovered that he had been making moves behind my back, subtle, calculated moves that slowly, but surely, made my position in the business more tenuous. There were whispers among the employees, hints that things were changing. I wasn't blind to it anymore. They had all been bought into the illusion that Gregory was the one who held the reins, and as long as he had my mother's backing, nothing would stop him. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I started meeting with the key people in the company, the ones who still remembered me and my role in the business. Slowly, but surely, I began to rebuild my connections. I made sure to remind them of the family legacy, of my mother's dreams, of the work we had all done together to build something meaningful. I couldn't do it alone, but with a little bit of persuasion, I could make them see that Gregory was only a temporary figurehead. I was the one who belonged at the top. The more I worked behind the scenes, the more I realized that my mother's silence was her approval. She had known what was happening, and yet she had said nothing. She had allowed Gregory to strip me of my place in the family. The pain of that realization was suffocating, but it also hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about getting back what was mine, it was about standing up to the woman who had betrayed me. One evening, as I sat alone in the study, going over my plans, my mother walked in. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes were heavy with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but there was something in the air between us, an unspoken tension, a knowledge that things could never go back to the way they were. She sat down across from me, her gaze never leaving mine. "Amelia," she began, her voice softer than usual but still cold. "I know what you're planning, and I just want you to understand that this is not about you. It's about what's best for all of us, for the family." I laughed softly, bitterly. The family, or is it just about Gregory and his children now? Her expression faltered, and for a brief moment I saw something like regret, but it was quickly masked by her practiced indifference. "You don't understand, Amelia. You think this is about money, about control. But it's not. It's about stability, about moving forward. Moving forward," I repeated, my voice cold, "by erasing me, by handing everything over to him." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're saying," she snapped. "You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted any of this? But you don't understand what's at stake." I leaned forward, my gaze unwavering. "No, Mother, I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is how you could let him take everything from me, how you could choose him over your own flesh and blood." For a moment, the silence stretched between us. It was suffocating, heavy with unspoken words. And then, as if to break the tension, my mother spoke again, but this time her voice was different, quieter, almost pleading. "I did what I had to do, Amelia." I stood up, my eyes locking with hers. "No, you did what you wanted to do, and now I'm going to do what I have to do." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding with a new sense of purpose. The game was on. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one who lost. The days that followed were a blur of quiet meetings, careful observations, and the relentless pursuit of information. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. I would not let my mother's betrayal slide. I would fight for my place in the family, and I would fight for what was rightfully mine. But what I didn't know yet was just how deep the lies ran, how far my mother and Gregory had gone to keep me out of the equation. I spent hours combing through old family documents, some of which had been left forgotten in dusty corners of the study, others hidden away in safe deposit boxes I knew existed but had never thought to open. It was in these boxes where I found more than I expected. Letters, emails, notes, proof that Gregory had been slowly and methodically building his empire, step by step, while I had been blissfully unaware of his intentions. One evening, while I was reviewing an old business contract, I found a series of emails exchanged between my mother and one of her financial advisors. The subject line read, "Future of Scott Enterprises, Action Required." My heart raced as I opened the thread, hoping for a glimpse into what was really going on. What I found made my stomach twist in knots. The emails detailed a plan to transfer the majority of the family assets, real estate, shares in various companies, investments, into Gregory's name. My mother had been actively signing off on these decisions without consulting me, without any consideration for my future. The most chilling part was a final email from my mother herself, stating, "Amelia will not be able to take over the business. Gregory is the right choice." I had always assumed my mother's love for me was unconditional, that she would protect me no matter what. But here it was, the cold truth. I was not only excluded from the future of Scott Enterprises, I had been completely written out of the plan. My mother was positioning Gregory to take over everything, and I was nothing more than a footnote in her grand design. I spent the next few days deep in thought. The anger inside me was burning, but I refused to let it consume me. I had a bigger goal now: expose the truth. I knew I couldn't do it alone, and I certainly couldn't confront my mother without solid proof. I needed allies, people who still believed in me and who knew the value of everything we had built. I reached out to one of the few people in the company who had always been loyal to me, Carla, my mother's former assistant. She had worked with us for years, and though she had retired years ago, I knew she still kept up with some of the family's business dealings. Carla had always been a confidant, someone who understood the ins and outs of Scott Enterprises better than anyone. We met at a small cafe on the edge of the city, where the low hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups offered us some privacy. Carla's face was tense when she saw me. She knew why I had called her, and I could see the concern in her eyes as I sat down across from her. "Amelia, I don't know if I should be involved in this," she said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "You know how things have changed. Gregory, he's not someone to cross. Your mother, she's made her choice." "I know," I replied, my voice calm but firm, "but I can't just let it happen. I can't let him take everything from me, from us. I need your help, Carla. I need you to show me where they've been hiding everything." She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as though checking to see if anyone was listening. After a moment, she nodded, her resolve hardening. "I can help you," she said, her voice low, "but you need to be careful. Gregory is dangerous, and your mother, she's not the woman you think she is anymore. She's changed, Amelia. And I don't know if you can bring her back from this." I felt a pang of sadness at her words. My mother was no longer the person I had always believed her to be, but that wasn't going to stop me. "I don't need her back," I said coldly. "I need to take back what's mine, and if I have to burn the entire house down to do it, then that's what I'll do." Carla glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help you, but we need to be smart. Gregory's been setting up accounts in his name, hiding assets overseas. You'll need to act quickly, or he'll bury everything before you even have a chance to fight. I felt a chill run down my spine as the weight of Carla's words sank in. Gregory wasn't just a man trying to take over a family business. He was a predator, and I had underestimated him. But no more. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my family, my legacy. Over the next few weeks, Carla and I worked in secret, piecing together a plan that would expose Gregory for who he truly was. We uncovered evidence of his shady dealings, his manipulation, and his calculated steps to ensure that he would remain untouchable. He had positioned himself as the rightful heir, and now I had to prove that everything he had done was based on lies. But as I worked through the documents, piecing together the puzzle of Gregory's deceit, a dark thought began to form in the back of my mind. Was my mother involved in this? Had she been complicit in his schemes all along, or had she truly been manipulated, just as I had been? The closer I got to the truth, the more I realized that I had been living in a house of mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed. My mother's betrayal was no longer just about her choosing Gregory over me. It was about something much darker, a web of lies, power, and greed that had been spun around me for years, and I had been too blind to see it. With every piece of evidence I uncovered, the walls of my mother's empire began to crumble. And with each passing day, I knew I was getting closer to the final confrontation. But as I gathered more evidence, I also began to fear the truth. If I exposed Gregory, would my mother stand by him, or would she finally see what he had done to us all? Would she choose him over me one final time? I didn't know the answer, but I was ready to find out. The days grew heavier as I inched closer to the truth. Each piece of evidence I uncovered was a shard of glass cutting into the fabric of the life I had known, and with each revelation, the weight on my chest grew unbearable. Gregory wasn't just after the family fortune. He was methodically breaking down everything my mother had worked for, and I was right in the middle of it all. I had spent weeks working in the shadows, gathering information, contacting old associates, piecing together financial records and legal documents, every step pushing me further into the dark abyss. But with the more I learned, the more I began to see that this wasn't just a betrayal of family, it was a betrayal of everything I had ever believed in. The love, the trust, the promises, all of it was crumbling. Carla had been invaluable in the process, guiding me through the labyrinth of documents, explaining how the financial scheming had been carefully orchestrated. But the closer we got to the final piece of the puzzle, the more uneasy I felt. There were gaps, inconsistencies in the story. Why had my mother been so eager to give up everything? Why had she let Gregory take over not just the business, but her heart? It was as if there was something more going on, something that I wasn't seeing. It was late one night when I decided to confront the one person who could give me the answers. The one person who could either shatter my already broken world or rebuild it. My mother. She had been distant ever since that night in the study, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't live in the darkness of doubt any longer. I needed to know if she had been complicit in Gregory's plans or if she had simply been manipulated. I waited for her to return home, pacing the halls of our once warm house, now a cold shell of what it used to be. Every room seemed to echo with the absence of the family I had once thought I knew. When I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. She entered the house quietly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I could see the weariness in her eyes, the lines of stress etched across her face. She wasn't the woman I had once known, the woman who had been my protector, my guide. Now, she was just a shadow of herself, hiding behind the man she had chosen over me. Amelia, she greeted me, her voice soft, almost hesitant. But there was no warmth in it, no love, just a cool, detached tone that made my stomach churn. "Sit down, please," I said, my voice calm but steady. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, but I knew the conversation would not go the way I expected. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't hesitate to sit across from me. The silence between us was thick, the air charged with unspoken words. "I know everything, Mother," I said, locking eyes with her. "I know about the will, I know about Gregory's plan, I know you've been signing everything away to him. I know you've been erasing me from our family's legacy, and I need you to tell me why." Her expression hardened, her lips pressing together in a thin line. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stared at me, as if weighing her words carefully. I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "Amelia," she finally said, her voice low, strained, "you don't understand. This was never about you. This is about the future, about stability. Gregory, he's the only one who can secure our family's future." My heart skipped a beat. "Stability?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You're telling me that selling me out, betraying me, was about stability?" She flinched but didn't back down. "I never wanted to hurt you, but you were too focused on the past. We needed to move forward. I needed someone strong to take over, someone who could handle what's coming." "What's coming?" I asked, my voice rising. "What's so dire that you had to cast aside your own daughter for this man?" She lowered her gaze, not meeting my eyes. I could see the struggle in her, the conflict between what she had done and the emotions that still lingered for me. Gregory was the only one who understood the business. He was the only one who had the vision to take it to the next level. I didn't trust you to carry it on, not after everything that happened. Everything that happened. It felt like a punch to my chest. My mind raced back to the years of my childhood, to the times when I had thought my mother's love for me was unshakable. But now, it was clear that her love had been conditional. Her trust had been given to a man who had manipulated her, and I had been cast aside as an afterthought. "Is that why you've been keeping me in the dark? Why you've been pushing me out of everything?" I asked, the hurt in my voice unmistakable. "All this time, I've been working to build something with you, and you've been silently preparing for him to take it all." She finally looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want this to happen, Amelia. I didn't want to hurt you, but Gregory, he gave me something you never could. Security. Assurance that our family would continue to thrive, no matter what." I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "And what about me, Mother? What about your only daughter? You've thrown me aside for a man you barely know, someone who sees me as a threat, as an obstacle. How could you do this?" "I did it because I thought it was the only way," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I was protecting you by letting him take control. I never wanted to see you fail, Amelia. But you were always too caught up in the past, in how things used to be. Gregory will make sure everything keeps going. I thought you would understand." I looked at her, my heart breaking. There was no more trust between us. What was left was just the shattered remnants of a relationship that could never be repaired. She had chosen him over me, over the bond we had shared for so many years. And now, there was nothing left but the truth. I walked toward the door, my voice low as I spoke the last words I would ever say to her. "I can't stay here anymore, Mother. You've made your choice. Now, I'll make mine." With that, I left the room, leaving my mother alone in the house she had built, the house that no longer felt like home. I wasn't sure where I would go next or how I would get back what I had lost, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this stand. Not anymore. The night I left the house was one I would never forget. I didn't look back as I walked away from the place that had once been my home, the place where I had grown up, the place where I had believed that love and loyalty would always be enough. But now, all of that had been torn apart. My mother had made her choice, and I had made mine. I wasn't just leaving her behind, I was leaving behind a life that had been built on false promises and broken trust. The first few days after I walked out were a blur. I stayed with Carla for a while, hidden away in the small apartment she had rented when she retired from the business. It was a refuge, a place where I could gather my thoughts and start to piece together a plan. But even as I tried to calm myself, the anger kept bubbling up. I couldn't let my mother's betrayal slide, and I couldn't let Gregory win. It became clear to me as I sat in the quiet of the apartment that the only way to fight back was to go after what mattered most to them, the business. The empire they had built together. I couldn't let them take it from me. I was the rightful heir, not Gregory's children. And if I had to tear down everything they had built to reclaim my place, then that was exactly what I would do. But I knew I couldn't act recklessly. If I was going to win this fight, I needed to be strategic. I needed to gather more information, make my move carefully, and build the support I would need to take back what was mine. For the next few weeks, I focused on strengthening my position. Carla continued to provide me with the information I needed about the business, while I used my network of old colleagues and contacts to dig deeper into the financials and the decision-making processes within Scott Enterprises. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how far Gregory's reach had gone. He had manipulated everything, from the company's direction to my mother's decisions. The real breakthrough came one evening when Carla handed me a set of documents she had been able to obtain from one of her old contacts. It was a series of contracts that my mother and Gregory had signed under the guise of business partnerships. However, hidden within the clauses were dangerous loopholes that would allow me to legally challenge Gregory's hold on the company. The contracts weren't as solid as they seemed, and I now had the key to dismantling Gregory's plan. I spent the next few days poring over the documents, looking for weaknesses in the legal framework. I needed to find a way to leverage this information, something that would give me the upper hand. The more I studied, the clearer it became. Gregory had underestimated me. He had been too focused on the idea that he could control everything, assuming that I would just fade into the background. But I wasn't going to fade. Not this time. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I had a thought that sent a shiver down my spine. If I was going to challenge Gregory and my mother, I needed a powerful ally. I couldn't do this alone. And there was only one person who could help me, someone who had always stood by my side, someone who had the power to turn the tables in my favor. My father's old business partner, Richard Hayes, was the key. Richard had been a part of the Scott Enterprises family since its earliest days. He and my father had built the company from the ground up, and after my father's death, Richard had remained a loyal advisor to my mother. But as time went on, Richard had grown disillusioned with the way my mother had handled the business. He had retired early, but I knew he still had connections, and he still had influence. If I could get him on my side, I would have a weapon strong enough to fight Gregory and my mother. I reached out to him cautiously, knowing that this wasn't going to be easy. Richard had always been a man of principle, and if he was going to back me, he needed to believe in the cause. I couldn't afford to waste time with half-hearted gestures. This had to be a full-fledged alliance. We met at his office the following week, and I could see the surprise in his eyes when I walked in. He had always known me as the quiet, studious daughter of my father, not as the woman who was ready to take on the world. But as I laid out my plan, as I showed him the documents I had uncovered and explained what Gregory had been doing to the company, his expression changed. It was the first time in years that I saw the old fire in his eyes. "You've got the right spirit, Amelia," Richard said after a long pause, "but this won't be easy. Gregory is dangerous. He's a master manipulator, and your mother, she's no longer the woman I once knew. But I've been watching her, and I can tell you one thing, she's not as invincible as she thinks." His words were like a spark to my soul, fueling the fire that had been burning inside me since I had left the house. Richard was right. Gregory was dangerous, but he wasn't untouchable. And my mother, though she had chosen to side with him, was vulnerable. She had let her greed and fear cloud her judgment, and now I had the tools to expose everything. "I need your help, Richard," I said, my voice steady with determination. "Together, we can take down Gregory and take back what's mine. I don't care what it takes. I will fight for Scott Enterprises, and I will fight for my family." Richard leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I didn't think I'd see the day when you'd be the one to fight for it, but I'm in. Let's take him down." And just like that, my plan began to take shape. I had an ally in Richard, and together, we would work to expose Gregory for the fraud he was. But even with Richard's support, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The battle would be long and brutal, and there would be no easy victory. But I was ready. I was done being the victim. It was time to reclaim everything that had been taken from me, no matter the cost. The storm was coming. And this time, I would be the one who controlled the wind. With Richard Hayes on my side, I felt like I was finally gaining the upper hand. We spent the next several weeks strategizing, poring over every detail of the business contracts and financials I had uncovered. Each time I found a new crack in Gregory's carefully crafted facade, the anger inside me grew stronger. He had used my mother, manipulated her, and had now set his sights on erasing me from the very foundation of Scott Enterprises. But I wasn't going to let him succeed. The legal battle was going to be long and complicated. Gregory had been too careful, too precise in his manipulation, but we had something he didn't: leverage. Every document, every deal he had made, could now be turned against him. It wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It was about the truth that had been buried under layers of deception. Carla had been an invaluable ally throughout this process. She had access to old business records and documents that were critical to piecing together Gregory's betrayal. Late nights were spent in her cramped apartment, where we analyzed every scrap of paper, every digital file that could shed light on Gregory's deceit. Slowly but surely, the pieces started to fit together. And with each piece, the bigger picture became clearer. Gregory had been siphoning money from Scott Enterprises, using his influence to line his pockets and set himself up as the sole heir to everything. But it wasn't just the financial manipulation that I needed to expose. I needed to prove that my mother had been complicit in all of this. Her role in Gregory's rise to power was the linchpin of the entire scheme. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that she had known what was happening. She had allowed him to take control. And now, she had to answer for it. I knew that confronting her again wouldn't be easy, but I had no choice. I had to force her to face the consequences of her actions. She had turned her back on me, and now it was time for her to see the damage she had done. Richard and I devised a plan to expose Gregory and my mother at the upcoming board meeting. It was the perfect opportunity. Gregory had been boasting about his new position within the company, and the meeting would be the stage for his grand unveiling as the new head of Scott Enterprises. But it would also be the stage for his undoing. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with tension. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me, but with Richard's support, I felt a surge of confidence. We had everything we needed: evidence, witnesses, and the truth. Gregory would have no way of wriggling out of this. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early, my heart pounding in my chest. The boardroom was grand, a symbol of the power Scott Enterprises once held. But today, it felt like a battlefield. Every step I took felt heavy, like I was walking toward my destiny. I had nothing left to lose. Richard was already there, sitting in the back with a few trusted allies who would back us up when the time came. I took my seat at the table, waiting for the others to arrive. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel Gregory's presence the moment he stepped into the room. He was as smug and confident as ever, his eyes scanning the room, looking for his next victim. But today, he wouldn't be the one calling the shots. The meeting began, and I listened intently as Gregory spoke about his vision for the future of Scott Enterprises. His words were smooth, calculated, as if he had convinced himself that he was the rightful heir. My mother sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of indifference. She had already made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. As the meeting progressed, I waited for the perfect moment. When the conversation shifted to the new business strategies and future investments, I seized the opportunity. I stood up, my voice steady, my eyes locking with Gregory's. "Actually, before we proceed," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade, "there's something we need to address first." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. Gregory raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering as I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. The silence in the room grew thick, and for a moment, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. "These documents," I continued, "contain evidence of Gregory's actions over the past few months. He's been funneling money out of Scott Enterprises, hiding assets, and using his position to enrich himself at the expense of the company." The room went still. Gregory's face turned white, and my mother's eyes darted nervously between me and him. It was the first time I had seen her show any sign of discomfort. "These contracts," I said, holding up the legal papers, "were signed under fraudulent circumstances, and they clearly show that Gregory has been using his influence to manipulate both my mother and the company. This was never about family. This was always about control, power, and money." I turned to my mother, my voice softer but no less cutting. "And you," I said, the words feeling like acid in my mouth, "allowed this to happen. You chose him over me, over the company, over everything we built together." My mother's face turned pale. For a moment I thought she might speak, but instead she remained silent, her eyes filled with regret. It was too late for apologies, too late for excuses. Gregory, however, wasn't so silent. He stood up, his face contorted in rage. "This is absurd. You can't just—" "I can and I will," I interrupted, my voice unwavering. "The truth is out, Gregory, and there's no escaping it." As the board members shuffled nervously in their seats, I laid out the final piece of my plan. I had already arranged for an emergency audit of Scott Enterprises, using the evidence I had gathered. It was over. Gregory's reign was about to come crashing down. The next few hours were a blur of tense confrontations, heated arguments, and broken promises. By the end of the meeting, Gregory's carefully constructed empire was in shambles. My mother, once so determined to protect him, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You were right, Amelia," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I made a terrible mistake, but I never wanted to lose you." The words were almost too late, but as I looked at her, I realized something. It didn't matter anymore. I had taken back control. The fight wasn't just for the company, it was for my own life. And with the truth finally exposed, I knew that I had won. Gregory was gone, my mother was left to pick up the pieces, and Scott Enterprises would be rebuilt, this time on my terms. The dust had settled in the wake of the board meeting, but the silence in the aftermath was deafening. Gregory had been removed from his position, and my mother, though still a part of the company, no longer held the same power she once had. I had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. It wasn't just about reclaiming the company, it was about reclaiming myself. But as I sat in the now quiet boardroom, I realized that the price of this victory was far greater than I had anticipated. I had expected to feel triumphant, to feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. But all I could feel was an overwhelming emptiness. Yes, I had fought hard to expose Gregory and uncover my mother's betrayal, but the cost of that fight was too high. My relationship with my mother was shattered beyond repair. I had lost her, not just as a business partner, but as the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally. The company was mine again, but it felt like a hollow victory. I had claimed what I was entitled to, but the emotional toll of what I had done left me with an aching void that nothing seemed to fill. The days after the meeting were filled with phone calls, meetings, and the task of rebuilding what had been broken. Scott Enterprises was left in shambles, and I was the one who had to pick up the pieces. The damage was far-reaching, from the financials to the staff who had been loyal to Gregory. Rebuilding trust in the company would take time. Rebuilding trust in myself felt like an even harder task. As the weeks passed, I found myself spending long hours in the office, pushing forward, refusing to let the emotional turmoil show. I couldn't afford to be weak, not now, not when the future of Scott Enterprises hung in the balance, but there was always a nagging voice in the back of my mind, reminding me of everything I had lost. My mother, my trust in her, and the simple, naive belief that love would always be enough. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I returned to the apartment where I had been staying. It was quieter now, no longer the refuge it had once been. Carla had moved out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I walked through the door and stood for a moment in the silence, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. That's when my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the board meeting. She had been quiet, distant, and I had assumed she was too ashamed to face me. But there she was, calling me. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to pick up and finally hear her say she was sorry, to hear her try to make amends. The other part of me knew that there was nothing she could say to undo what had been done. I took a deep breath and answered. "Amelia," her voice came through the phone, thin and fragile. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I need you to understand something." I didn't respond immediately, my chest tightening as I listened to her. She had always been the one to speak, to control the conversation. But this time, I was the one who was silent, waiting for her to say the words I had longed to hear. "I never wanted to lose you," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "What I did was wrong, but I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I didn't see how much you were hurting, how much you were being pushed aside. And now, I see the consequences of my choices." I closed my eyes, fighting the lump in my throat. The ache of betrayal was still there, sharp and raw, but it was slowly fading, replaced by something else, indifference. I had won, but at what cost? My mother's apologies felt too late. She couldn't erase the years of neglect, the years of turning her back on me for the sake of a man she barely knew. "You don't get to decide what's best for me anymore," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You lost that right the moment you chose him over me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, the weight of my words settling in. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Amelia," she said quietly. "But I hope one day you can understand. I hope one day you'll see that I was just trying to protect you, even if it meant making mistakes along the way." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was, I had already forgiven her in my own way. But that didn't mean I was willing to forget. She had taken away too much for me to simply let it go. I'm done with this, I said, the finality in my words settling in. Goodbye, Mother. I hung up before she could say anything more. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. The battle was over. Gregory was gone. The company was mine again. And though it wasn't the victory I had hoped for, it was a victory nonetheless. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and rebuilding. The business started to stabilize, the board of directors slowly coming around as I made decisions that were firm but fair. But no matter how much I worked, I could never fully erase the pain of what had happened. I had gotten everything I wanted, but I still found myself standing in the ruins of my family's legacy, wondering if it was all worth it. One morning, after months of navigating the fallout, I stood in front of my office window, looking out over the city that had always been home. I realized something. The company was mine, the battle had been won, but now it was time to rebuild not just the business, but myself. And with that realization, I knew the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part would be learning to live without the ghosts of the past haunting me. But as I stood there, looking out at the horizon, I finally understood. I was stronger than I had ever known. The storm had passed, and now I could finally begin again. It had been months since that fateful board meeting, and I had come a long way. The wounds from my past, while still raw, were starting to heal, but it wasn't a quick or easy process. Every decision I made, every interaction with the remaining members of the board, and every conversation with my mother left me with a bitter reminder of how far I had fallen, from being a trusted heir to being cast aside in favor of a stranger. But despite the heartache, I had grown stronger. My resolve had become unbreakable. Scott Enterprises was in the process of being rebuilt, but it was more than just about money or business. It was about reclaiming the power that had once been mine. It was about taking back control of my life and no longer letting the past dictate my future. I had spent weeks revisiting the company's foundation, meeting with key players, reassuring the staff, and rebuilding relationships that had been fractured during Gregory's reign. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing had become crystal clear to me. I was in charge now, and I would not allow anyone to take that from me again. But even as the company began to stabilize, something gnawed at me, something I couldn't quite place. My victory felt incomplete. I had won the battle, yes, but what had it really cost me? My mother's love, my sense of trust in people, the idea of family. I had fought for all those things, but in the end, I realized I couldn't bring them back. No amount of money or business success could fill that empty space. One evening, as I sat alone in my office, watching the city lights twinkle through the glass, I found myself reflecting on everything I had lost and everything I had gained. I had built this company with my father, and I had been raised to lead it. But I never imagined that the journey to claim what was rightfully mine would come at such a high cost. The emotional scars, the weight of betrayal, and the loneliness that came with being the one who took the hardest road were all real and undeniable. But as I looked at the city, I realized something else too. I had survived, and I was stronger than I had ever been before. The door to my office creaked open, and I turned to see Richard Hayes standing there. He had been my most trusted ally throughout this journey, and despite the obstacles, he had stuck by my side when it mattered most. "Everything looks like it's starting to settle," Richard said, stepping into the room. His voice was calm, measured as always. "You've done well, Amelia. I'm proud of you." I smiled faintly, leaning back in my chair. "Thank you, Richard. It's been a lot harder than I ever imagined, but I think I'm getting there." He took a seat across from me, his gaze serious. "You've done more than just get by. You've rebuilt a legacy that was being torn apart. You've reclaimed your place in this company and in your family's history." I nodded, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "But at what cost, Richard? I don't know if I can ever forgive my mother. She knew what was happening. She chose him over me. And now, even though I've reclaimed everything, I'm still missing something." Richard leaned forward, his eyes kind but firm. "Amelia, you can't change the past. What happened with your mother, what happened with Gregory, those are things you'll never be able to undo. But you've built something that's yours. That's the legacy you're creating now. And no one can take that from you." His words, though comforting, didn't erase the lingering ache I felt. The emptiness in my chest wasn't something I could fill with business success or accolades. It was a part of me now, something I would carry with me as I moved forward. The weeks turned into months, and the company slowly began to recover. Scott Enterprises was back on track, and the staff started to rally behind me, seeing me as the leader I was always meant to be. But as the business grew stronger, so did the quiet moments of doubt that lingered in the background of my mind. I had rebuilt everything, but I still wasn't whole. One late afternoon, as I walked through the lobby of the headquarters, I caught a glimpse of a family photo hanging on the wall, a photo of my mother, my father, and me. It was taken before everything fell apart, before the world I had known had crumbled. I paused for a moment, staring at the image. My father had always believed in me. He had trusted me to carry on his work, to lead the company. And in some ways, I had done that. I had fought, I had won, and I had built something that would carry his name forward. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that in all my victories, I had lost something even more precious. I didn't know if I would ever be able to repair the relationship with my mother. The wounds were too deep and the betrayal too great. But I also knew that I couldn't keep letting that loss control me. I couldn't let it define who I was becoming. That evening, I sat down at my desk and wrote a letter. It was a letter I had been avoiding for so long. I addressed it to my mother. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say the things I never could. I can never forgive you for what happened. I can never erase the pain you caused me. But despite everything, I still hope for you. I hope that one day, you'll understand why I had to do what I did. I hope that maybe, in time, you'll see that this fight wasn't just about the company. It was about reclaiming the truth. It was about reclaiming me. I folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in an envelope. I didn't know if I would ever send it. But writing it felt like a release, like I had finally said what I needed to say, even if my mother never heard it. And with that, I stood up and looked out over the city again. The night was quiet, the lights of the buildings below twinkling in the distance. The storm had passed, and now I could finally begin to rebuild, not just the company, but my life. I had fought for everything that mattered to me. And now, for the first time, I could finally breathe. It was early morning when I received the call that would change everything. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light through the windows of my office. I sat at my desk, sorting through the paperwork from the previous day when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Amelia," came a voice I hadn't heard in months. It was my mother. Her voice was strained, her tone heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "I need to see you. There's something I need to say." The words hit me like a wave. I didn't know if I was ready to face her, to hear whatever it was that she needed to say after everything that had happened. But I couldn't ignore her. I couldn't keep running from the past forever. "Where?" I asked, my voice more composed than I felt. "The old house," she replied. "Please, Amelia, it's important," I agreed, my heart pounding as I set the phone down. The house, the place where everything had begun. The place where I had once felt loved, safe, and part of a family. But that house had also been where the first cracks had formed in our relationship, where the betrayal began. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had worked so hard to build my own life, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But now, it seemed like the past was calling me back, dragging me toward a confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for. I drove to the house, each mile feeling heavier than the last. As I pulled up to the driveway, I noticed that the house looked much the same as it had before. The manicured lawn, the grand entrance, it all felt like a distant memory. But as I stepped out of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air was thick with anticipation, as though this moment had been building for a long time. When I walked into the house, my mother was waiting in the living room. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered. Her face was tired, and her eyes held a sadness I had never seen before. She was sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, as though waiting for me to speak first. I took a seat across from her, the space between us feeling like a chasm that would never be crossed. "You wanted to talk," I said, my voice cold but not unkind. "What is it, Mom?" She took a deep breath, her eyes not meeting mine. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, her voice broke the silence. "I've spent so many months thinking about everything that happened, Amelia, about what I did to you, and I've realized something. I failed you. I failed as a mother. I failed to protect you. And I can never undo the damage I caused." I felt my breath catch in my throat. My mother had always been the one who held the power in our relationship, who controlled the narrative. To hear her admit her mistakes, to see her vulnerability, was both painful and disorienting. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, she continued, her voice trembling. But I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost, Amelia, I was scared. And I thought that by aligning myself with Gregory, I was protecting everything we had built. But I was wrong. I should have protected you instead. I should have seen how much he was hurting you. I should have chosen you. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Her words were like a double-edged sword. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I didn't need her, that I didn't care about her apology. But now, sitting in front of her, I realized just how much I had wanted to hear this. For so long, I had held onto my anger, my resentment. I had told myself that I didn't need her validation, that I didn't need her love. But now, as the weight of her words sank in, I could feel the walls I had built around myself beginning to crack. I don't know what to say, I finally whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I needed to hear that. I needed to know that you see what you've done. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Instead, she just reached across the distance between us, her hand trembling slightly as she held mine. I know it doesn't change anything, she said softly. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to make things right. I don't expect you to come back to me. I don't expect you to forget. But I hope one day, when you're ready, we can find a way to heal, to rebuild what was lost. I looked down at her hand in mine, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. This was not the end of our story, but it was a beginning to something new. Something that, for the first time in a long time, felt possible. Maybe one day, I said quietly, my voice still unsure, but not today. And with that, I stood up, leaving the house for the second time. This time, however, it felt different. The air wasn't as heavy. The past hadn't been erased, but I could see a glimmer of hope where once there had been only darkness. I didn't know if I would ever fully forgive my mother, but I knew that for the first time, she had shown me a glimpse of the woman she used to be. And for that, I could finally breathe. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the past lifting, if only just a little. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't walking it alone. And with that, the road to redemption, both for me and for my family, began. The weeks following my meeting with my mother felt like a strange, surreal limbo. The city buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, but within me, everything was shifting. I had done the hard work. I had fought for what was mine, Scott Enterprises, my legacy, my place in this world. But now, there was a new challenge ahead of me, one that wasn't about business or betrayal. It was about something much deeper, healing. I had spent so much time fighting against the world, against the people who had wronged me, that I had forgotten about the most important thing of all, the need to heal within myself. The damage I had suffered wasn't just from my mother's betrayal or Gregory's manipulation. It was from the constant battle, the constant push to prove my worth, the belief that I had to fight for love, for validation, for the recognition I deserved. Now I had everything I thought I wanted. I had the company, the control, and even the apology from my mother, however late it had come. But I still felt an emptiness, a hollowness that nothing seemed to fill. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, but I knew I couldn't go on like this, constantly battling, constantly pushing myself to the edge. It was Carla, as always, who helped me see it. After months of hard work and sleepless nights, she suggested I take a step back, focus on something outside of the chaos that had consumed me for so long. Amelia, you can't keep running on empty, she had said, her voice gentle but firm. You've been through hell and you've come out on top, but you can't keep pretending that it doesn't matter. You need to find peace with yourself. You need to rest. You need to live. At first, I resisted. I had built everything I had around work, around fighting for my place. I didn't know who I was without the fight, without the pressure. But eventually, I realized Carla was right. I couldn't continue to carry this weight forever. I needed to take a breath, to figure out who I was now that the battle was over. And so, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I took a sabbatical from the company. I handed over the day-to-day responsibilities to a trusted team of executives and took some time off, something I hadn't done in years. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, not because I didn't trust the team, but because I wasn't sure who I was without the constant pressure. The first few days were uncomfortable. I felt restless, uncertain. But slowly, I began to breathe again. I took walks along the beach, something I hadn't done in so long. I reconnected with old friends, people I had neglected during the years of fighting. I spent time with Carla, rediscovering the simple joys of life that had nothing to do with work or business. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I was giving up the very thing that had driven me for so long. But as the days passed, something shifted inside me. I began to understand that success wasn't just about building a company or reclaiming what was mine. It was about finding balance, about nurturing the parts of myself that had been neglected for so long. It was about rediscovering the joy of simply living, of taking care of myself, of allowing myself to heal from the wounds of the past. One afternoon, as I sat in the quiet of a cafe, sipping my coffee and watching the world go by, I realized something. I wasn't just rebuilding the company, I was rebuilding myself. I was learning how to live again, how to find joy without the constant weight of battle on my shoulders. I wasn't perfect. I wasn't fully healed. But I was on the road to becoming someone new, someone who didn't need to fight for validation anymore, someone who could find peace in the present moment. As the weeks turned into months, I gradually returned to Scott Enterprises. But this time, I did so with a different perspective. I wasn't there to prove myself. I wasn't there to fight. I was there to lead, yes, but also to nurture and build something that lasted, not just in terms of business, but in terms of relationships, trust, and balance. I started implementing changes in the company, things that focused on fostering a positive, inclusive culture, one where everyone, from the lowest level employee to the highest executives, felt valued. I built stronger connections with the people around me, listening more and demanding less. I made sure that the company I had fought for would be one that didn't repeat the mistakes of the past, one that didn't sacrifice relationships for power. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I struggled with the scars of my past, the betrayal of my mother, the loss of my old self, the weight of the decisions I had made. But I had learned something crucial over the past months. Healing wasn't a linear path. It was a journey, and I was finally ready to walk it. One evening, as I sat alone in my office, looking out over the city, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past was no longer controlling me. The battles were over. I had won the war, but the true victory came in knowing that I could finally let go of the fight. I had rebuilt Scott Enterprises. I had reclaimed what was mine. But more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it, not as the woman who fought to survive, but as the woman who had finally learned how to live.